Welcome to everyone, both panelists and participants. My name is Amy Krupel, and I am the director of the UF Center for European Studies. The Center for European Studies is both a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and part of the Jean Monnet in the US network of Jean Monnet programs. We are also a federally funded Title VI National Resource Center. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and it will be available on the CES website. We will have a question and answer session following the presentation, and we encourage participants to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens and not through the chat window. We want to thank everyone for joining us today to discuss the human dimension of heritage in the EU. This panel and the virtual series of which it is part are supported by the EU's Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet program. This discussion is part of our center's series, EU Cultural Policy Beyond Masters and Museums, which explores the history, politics, and implementation of EU cultural policy, examining issues such as cultural heritage protection, participation and inclusion in EU cultural heritage, and global heritage and EU foreign policy. For details on other panels in the series, please visit ces.ufl.edu. And just to note, we do have one more webinar coming up, I believe on April 20th, and we will send all registered participants information on that panel as well. Our panel today includes three panelists. We have with us Dr. Karolina Nikielska-Sekula, Associate Professor of Human Geography at the University of Southeastern Norway, where she works on migration and heritage studies, urban sociology, and ethnographic methods. We also have Dr. Andreas Wiesand, Executive Director at the European Institute for Comparative Cultural Research and Director of ArcCult Media. He has worked as an expert for the EU Commission, the European Parliament, UNESCO, and the European Cultural Foundation. And Dr. Alexandra Xanthaki, where she teaches at Brunel University, London, where she teaches on human rights and has published extensively on Indigenous and minority and cultural rights. For additional complete information on all of the panelists, please visit the event page where you registered. Our panel today is moderated by Dr. Andrzej Jakubowski, who is one of the three guest scholars leading our UFJMCE special seminar and the virtual workshop on EU cultural policy. He is an assistant professor at the University of Opole, at the Institute of Law Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and co-editor of Cultural Heritage in the European Union, a critical inquiry into law and policy. And with that, I will hand things over to our moderator with just one additional request. At the end of the talk, as you leave, you will be carried over to an event survey, and we ask you kindly to complete that survey to provide us additional information on how you found out about us and how we might provide additional panels and webinars for you in the future. And with that, I hand things over, Andrzej, to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krupel, for this introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce this workshop on human dimension of cultural heritage in the European Union. In fact, the linkage between human rights, cultural rights, and heritage is today widely recognized at the regional and global level. As the United Nations Human Rights Council stressed in several occasions, the protection and enjoyment of cultural heritage are more often perceived as essential for the safeguarding of human dignity, an important component of promotion and protection of all human rights, including the full realization of cultural rights. How the relation between heritage and human rights is, however, very complex and multi-dimensional. The first dimension is that of human right to heritage. This derives from the right of everyone to participate in cultural life of society, enshrined in human rights instruments since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These rights may be enjoyed by individuals in community with others, or collectively. And it can be translated as a right to access and enjoy cultural heritage. Heritage, traditions, values might be also a vehicle of human rights. This aspect is relevant for constitutional democratic traditions of member states of the European Union and the Council of Europe, very much encapsulated in the concept of cultural diversity. Also, heritage can be very problematic, as certain cultural rights may be intention or conflict with some universally recognized fundamental rights. This may result in relativization of certain rights and different standards of protection in various countries and jurisdictions. Also, conflict may lead to conflict between majority and minority cultures. Human rights can also serve as vehicle of enforcing cultural heritage rights. This is also the case of European regional human rights system, where the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights shows that the realization of fundamental human rights can serve as a means to preserve and enjoy heritage. Finally, the practical operation of heritage and human rights may be very problematic, as these two spheres are usually dealt by separate legal regimes and in practice also by separate administrative bodies. In the European Union, this tension generally refers to the clashes between the protection of national culture, national heritages of member states, communities within these states, who often enjoy different legal status, different legal standings before courts and public administration. In such a context, this workshop will consider both human rights law in the dimension of cultural heritage and the role that heritage plays in protecting and realizing all human rights comprising cultural rights. And I'm very happy for these three talks. Our first speaker is Professor Andreas Wiesand, and in his talk, who owns and controls cultural heritage benefits, he will discuss the socio-cultural benefits of cultural heritage for education and quality of life, social cohesion, and material conditions in European regions, also highlighting some important challenges in this regard. Then Professor Xanthaki from Brunel University present the problems or challenges with protection, enjoyment of human rights related to cultural heritage of minorities and indigenous people in the European Union, focusing on aspects of community participation and inclusion. And our third expert, Dr. Karolina Nikielska-Sekula, in her talk, Inclusion Without Participation, Institutional Attempts of Minorities Heritage Inclusion, on the example of Norsk Folkemuseum, will focus on attempts of inclusion of immigrant minorities heritage by the mainstream institutions, also discussing the issue of participation of minorities in this process. So after this, we'll have a chance for discussion. So Professor Wiesand, would you like to start?
It's a pleasure to be together with you in this session. Actually, we are meeting in a turbulent time when in most European countries, the only freely accessible heritage institutions are cemeteries. Usually, or not just now because of the pandemic, they are the most visited places of culture in Europe, of culture, of landscape, of remembrance in our society. In addition, many historic cemeteries actually are protected as part of our cultural heritage. So mentioning them is not by chance at this very troubling time. Let me start with an information on what we are doing at the moment. You see here the concept of a project we are just carrying out with Italian partners at the moment for ESPON, an agency of the European Union. It is on based on empirical evidence. We try to identify the socio-cultural benefits of cultural heritage for education, our quality of life, for social cohesion, and material conditions in European regions. In that context, of course, also some disadvantages for inhabitants, for residents, for societal groups, minorities, etc. are also, of course, to be analyzed. I just mentioned the issue of over-tourism, which some of our cities are facing in Europe. There are other issues concerning heritage, which are heavily discussed, but where I don't have just the time to deal with, like neglected heritage, or the problem of restoration works blocked by economic or political interests. These and other issues can, of course, be discussed later. Maybe you have own experiences in that respect. Usually, scientists start with a definition. So I'm also showing you the one adopted by Harriwell Project. First of all, tangible cultural heritage with a number of items included there, as you can see. And then also the intangible cultural heritage, which is quite a differentiated part of our heritage system. Now, these types of definitions are, of course, not without criticism. We have had several interesting conferences on that, and among those issues mentioned, I have here a few ones to look at. Basically, the problem is that this is a very static way of looking at cultural heritage, because heritage is in a constant movement and is constantly being reinterpreted. Another issue is, of course, that the main focus of many international treaties is on the protection of objects or practices, the conservation of them, while the role of specialists and human communities are often neglected in that context. Also, people find that the division between tangible and intangible heritage is a bit misleading, because very often these things are being connected, and so it's complicated to put them into different baskets. As well, the issue of digital heritage is one that still needs further discussion. We have, of course, ideas of UNESCO and other international bodies distinguishing between digitized and born digital heritage, but there's still some part to go before we reach a good recognition and maybe even some international agreements on that. Also, some forms of cultural heritage are, depending on the situation in different countries or different beliefs, are disputed. For example, the role of language in heritage, the question how to deal with embarrassing and contested heritage. We have traditions related to environmental action, which are very interesting. We have a sort of what I call consumer heritage, which is what you collect on your own, and which in many cases can mean a lot to you as a human being, but of course is not necessarily being protected. And finally, cultural heritage as a resource for contemporary creativity, which is also something people find that it is not being recognized enough. Here I have an example. I was lucky and fortunate to grow up in Baden-Baden. That's a sparse city with its own television, regional television station, which actually staged the American Folk Blues Festival in the early 1960s when I was young. And since my mother was a jazz photographer, I met all these people, and many of them were at our home. And I had a feeling who is really part still of the old blues heritage, and who is sort of a newcomer and is making something totally new out of this heritage. So that was my daily experience at the time. And here I have on the other side a proof of that. That is how these American blues musicians actually taught the most famous rock stars that later on became most famous, like Eric Clapton, Steve Winwood, Charlie Watson, you could name many others, in sessions. And that actually shows the transition of heritage into something new, into a new form of art. I just wanted to mention that example because it is so striking to me. Now, I have to deal with the question of who owns and controls cultural heritage benefits. I mean, there are many international treaties and national or regional regulations which seem to suggest a lead role for the state in that respect. And there are other hotly discussed issues regarding these conventions and the protection of heritage in general, as you can see here on this slide. Among them, reinterpretation of cultural heritage as a sort of new tool for reinforcing nationalism in some European countries, where a lot of money is actually being spent for heritage, but for mainly political purposes. And also the fact that I just mentioned, the other thing that international legislation, treaties are sometimes contradicting, as you can study when you look at underwater cultural heritage. And also this issue of fragmentation of heritage. So many different specialists have been trying to build on that issue of cultural heritage, and each one more or less has created its own little box or home or castle where the own view is being defended, but the other issues are not really in sight, you know. The Faro Convention of the Council of Europe, luckily, is sort of an effort to get out of these problems, this deadlock. And it has a few interesting messages in addition to being really strictly based on your human rights concept. You know? Like you can read here, Article 4A, everyone alone or collectively has the right to benefit from the cultural heritage and to contribute towards its enrichment. Now, this cannot be found anywhere else, really, in this clearness. So I would really consider this to be a European achievement that we have come at least to recognize it. Also, it has a holistic role on cultural heritage. It doesn't distinguish, for example, between tangible and intangible. It has a strong educational and development approach, and like the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention of the UNESCO, it also recognizes heritage communities. So we are here at the human factor, the human role of human beings in who are not necessarily specialists, but who are involved and can be involved, and they play a large role in this. However, I have to say that this, as interesting this convention is, it also has its limits, because it's a framework treaty, so it's not really providing binding requirements for governments, no enforceable rights, as it says, and governments still stay as the sole guarantors of the implementation of the convention. And last not least, it has only been ratified by 19 of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, including very few from Western Europe. So that is really a bit a problem. Here you can see again what I just said, that the Council of Europe Faro Convention, Framework Convention on the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society, is actually the only one who has a very clear human rights base written in it, while others only do this very indirect or not at all. The other Council of Europe, by the way, maybe some of you are not so fully aware what this is. The difference between Council of Europe and European Union. Council of Europe is a intergovernmental organization. It is not the EU. It is larger. It encompasses many more European countries, and it has its own set of international conventions, treaties, many of them concerning heritage. The European Union, on its part, tries increasingly, one has to say, to also being active in the field of cultural heritage, not the least during the activities of the European Year of Cultural Heritage 2018. That was a really important yearly event, annual event. So no, not annual, sorry. My language isn't really that perfect. It went over the whole year, and over 6 million people took part in nearly 12,000 events organized in 37 countries. As a consequence of that year, the European Union presented a framework of over 60 actions related to the promotion and protection of cultural heritage in the longer terms, based on 5 pillars, as they call it. The importance of the human dimension in heritage action is underlined in the first pillar of this plan: cultural heritage for an inclusive Europe, participation and access for all. So the participation aspect is here the main driver for this action plan. However, we need to be aware that the European Union has only a very limited competencies in the domains of culture, including heritage. In particular, a harmonization of cultural and heritage policies is explicitly forbidden in the EU treaties. We must therefore check the EU member states in order to find more about this issue. And looking at that, you can see that cultural heritage policy priorities in a number of European countries, I must say not in all of them, have indeed shifted towards encouraging participation and inclusion of broader segments of the population in heritage-related activities. In that respect, the Cultural Roots program of the Council of Europe is also an interesting proof for the desire to involve individuals, groups, as well as regions and states across borders in efforts to revitalize the idea of a common, trans-border, diverse European cultural heritage. I'm coming now to another issue, and that is that the cultural heritage in Europe is increasingly being contested. Before doing that, I would like to pause for a moment and discuss with you my interim findings, so to speak. My view is that heritage can hardly generate meaning. Yeah, I have to close that one. I don't know how to do it that fast. Sorry.
Can I interrupt, because can we leave this discussion for the end of the session? No, because discussion of these different aspects. No, because I think we are running out of time.
Okay.
A little bit. So
I come to my final conclusions, right?
Yes, and then we can come during discussion. We can come back to these contested issues.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. So my view is that heritage can hardly generate meaning on its own. Only human beings, and above all their institutions, provide the diverse meanings and recognitions related to cultural heritage. And generally, such meanings cannot claim to be universal. Rather, they develop through ascription, appropriation, demarcation, or differentiation. For some of us, creates a deeper, even emotional bond can be of no value to others. Take, for example, a totem or a pole or an old saint statue. For the one, it's a symbol for belonging to a community. For others, it's individual comfort or fulfillment of faith. It may be an outdated or even repulsive symbol for others. That being said, I have to come to my closing words. Even if it may hurt some cultural heritage specialists, if we take differing, changing human perspectives into account, cultural heritage assets are necessarily ambivalent. They can both promote cohesion and trigger conflicts, or like language as a cultural asset, they can simply accompany and support us in our daily life. This ambivalence doesn't spare out major heritage institutions. Here, the resume of an African writer, Mea Mwangi, after participating in a sponsored cultural tour through Europe, it's pitiful when you have to go to a museum to see your own culture. The above examples demonstrate that cultural heritage is not eternally sacrosanct. Its background or values are increasingly being contested. Its protection depends on political and societal choices. Obviously, cultural heritage is not a straightforward blueprint for the social norms and values on which our society rests and develop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Wiesand, for this very rich, and I think we have much to discuss at the second part of this workshop. So, Professor Xanthaki, would you like to?
Great. So good afternoon, and I'm just going to continue from where Professor Wiesand left. So this is the So this is the grand finale of the European Year of Cultural Heritage 2018, and I was wondering whether there is anything that you can spot. So as we say in Britain, spot the brown man or the brown woman, spot the Muslim, spot anyone who looks like a member of a minority. So this represents exactly what the EU, what I have to say about the EU and the protection of cultural heritage of minorities and indigenous peoples. I think that I could, for reasons of time, I could just leave it to that. A lot of talk, a lot of experts, but on paper, and I'll come back to the exceptions, but on paper, we don't see the actual participation. Even more so, we don't see the actual lead of minorities and indigenous peoples themselves in the issues that concern them relating to the protection of their cultural heritage. And this is how it looks. It is quite prohibiting for still, the EU is quite prohibiting, EU law rather, is quite prohibiting still for minorities and indigenous peoples and their the protection of their cultural heritage. First of all, the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. So the human rights aspect of the European Union, or a very large part of the human rights aspect of the European Union, makes no explicit recognition to the right of cultural heritage and makes no recognition to the rights of minorities. So there is no direct protection from that. Secondly, the European law keeps talking about the European way of life and the European values and the European human rights, as if human rights were only created in Europe and as if there is only one European way of life. And I can assure you that being Greek in London, my life, my way of life in Greece was certainly very different to my way of life in London. So this idea and this emphasis that you can also see these days, through statements of officials, but also in European law and policy, the European way of life should at least be changed to the European ways of life. And finally, the EU law, exactly as Professor said, probably more eloquently than I will, the European law is still a matter for member states. So it is not a matter for the European Union because of subsidiarity, lets the member states to take action when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage. This means that the money, the projects, the priorities are going to be determined by the state. And guess what? If the state has to determine between protecting artifacts belonging to the national majority vis-a-vis artifacts belonging to the minorities, especially when these minorities create problems in the state and are not as loyal as the state would like them to be, who's going to win? However, we should not be too discouraged. First of all, the reality is that indirectly there is protection of minorities' cultural heritage, usually through action that is aimed towards the protection of regional cultural policies. So when there is action for local, in order to protect local cultures and local cultural elements, often we see that these are minorities. And maybe that's a way of the EU, a very diplomatic way of actually protecting minority cultural policies in a way that does not create tension, but still has the same effect. Unfortunately, in Europe, especially since 9/11, but minorities are not seen in a very positive light. So they are, to a very large degree, seen as troublemakers. And by not saying that the policies are going to protect minorities, but by saying that the policies are going to protect local populations, maybe the EU is trying to reach the same effect, but in a more diplomatic way. That's the romantic talking here. We also have to recognize that cultural heritage is protected when it comes to the intangible bit. So, and this is mainly through non-discrimination. So let's try and see a little bit more in depth these issues. The Lisbon Treaty does talk about the rights of minorities and talks about non-discrimination, but doesn't talk at all about cultural heritage or cultural diversity. The Treaty of the EU does talk about respect for diversity and talks about protect EU cultural heritage. So again, we see this very centralized idea of cultural heritage and the EU. However, one could explain it in an expansive way, in a way that includes the various elements of majorities and minorities. So EU cultural heritage. And the Charter, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, talks about the rights of minorities and protection again of cultural diversity. So one, by putting these very important documents of the European Union together, could say that in conjunction, through these, we do have the protection of cultural, the EU law does protect the cultural heritage of minorities and indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, this is not the case, because the EU has these documents do not constitute a legal basis for action by the institutions. something that my colleague implied earlier. So in essence, this means that the EU has no obligation to take positive action to materialize these provisions. So the EU has no obligation to take positive action for minorities and indigenous peoples' cultural heritage. And finally, I don't want to bombard you with kind of all the documents of the EU, but just the main documents to prove our point. The Treaty on the Functioning of the EU that has legal effect, that is part of the legal order, does say that there should be cooperation among member states, and if necessary, the EU is going to support and supplement their action regarding the cultural heritage of European significance. Again, this is primarily, one could see it as positive, but it does talk about cultural heritage of European significance. So one would question who is going to decide whether this is of significance. And secondly, what happens to the cultural heritage of minorities that are not of European significance, but are of, their local significance. So again, this is a bit of a problem. And finally, as you saw even there, it says that the main actors are going to be member states, and the EU may decide, who knows, to help a little bit in a supplementary way the member states. So again, we don't have a very clear obligation. But okay, you will tell me, that's fine. EU law is not going to help us. Fine. Let's focus on international law. Let's say that the EU has the responsibility of following the international law standards on cultural rights and the protection of cultural heritage. Unfortunately, we're not going to find more protection there. The EU is not party to any of these treaties that protect cultural rights, hence cultural heritage, apart from one. So the EU has signed and ratified the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion on Diversity of Cultural Expressions, but and it is diversity of cultural expression, so it is relating. It relates to cultural heritage. Unfortunately, this convention is of limited help for the protection. It's not a very strong convention, and it has quite a lot of weaknesses. So where does this leave us? This leaves us in a way that in concluding that the EU law does not offer a lot of protection to minorities' cultural heritage. If you remember in the first slide, when I talked about the European Court of Human Rights, I put a little asterisk, and this is the asterisk. Small, but important. So the European Court of Human Rights has talked about issues that relate to cultural heritage of minorities. So they have talked about the minority way of life, specifically with respect to the Roma. They have talked about the right of minorities to seek historical truth with respect to Holocaust and the rights of members of minorities to demand that these historical truths are being acknowledged and confirmed. And finally, when it comes to linguistic rights of minorities, so the linguistic heritage of minorities, and maybe the heritage that comes through the TV, again, way of life, etc. So that's why, I said that when it comes to the way of life of minorities, maybe it is protected more. Not so much by broadly speaking, EU law, mainly the European Court of Human Rights. Indigenous peoples, I'm not talking a lot about them, but maybe they are in a better position. They have exactly the same concerns and rights as minorities. However, they have two, tactically speaking, strategically speaking, they have two issues that act in their favor. First of all, they can be seen as a special case. So the states do not feel that they open the floodgates by protecting their cultural heritage. And they are seen as the very vulnerable groups. So the Sami and in Sami land and other such very small groups, Greenlanders, etc. And secondly, they are very small numbers of groups. So, again, they're the exception and they're a small number. So the EU, the member states are more are more open to them. One of the most important issues that they have pushed, the Indigenous movement, the European Indigenous movement are pushing for are the repatriation of Indigenous artifacts. And they even had success with going to the European Parliament in 2016. But again, like with minorities, all these initiatives can only be done through, can mainly be done through local governments and have success through local governments. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that European EU law as such does not actually protect cultural heritage of minorities and indigenous peoples. However, EU policies and action do and have protected some elements of minority cultural heritage, first of all through non-discrimination, and secondly through local populations and local emphasis on local cultures. And in this respect, intangible heritage seems to work better, seems to get more protection than tangible heritage, especially through the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Xanthaki. There are some questions in chat, but I will keep them to the end of the session, because there are some questions to you. So now I would like to invite Dr. Karolina Nikielska-Sekula.
Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me, and many thanks to the preceding speakers for very informative presentations. And I think I'm going to follow up and build on what you've already said, giving some deeper insight into some case studies that I prepared for today. So in my presentation, I'm asking a question, whether we can talk about inclusion without participation. And I decided to present two case studies from Norwegian folk museum, focusing on institutional attempts of minorities' heritage inclusion. And this is where I start. Several scholars have argued that there is this tendency of so-called multicultural societies to accept just some elements of minorities' culture that resemble a safe folklore, while reject or even denormalize or decriminalize or criminalize those cultural practices that do not comply with a mainstream norm. And this argument was raised in a bit different context that I'm going to talk about today. That is in Australia, in the UK context. But in my own research from Norway, I found out that this can also be true for Norway. And here I'm presenting a statement by Prescott, who comments in this way the Norwegian attempts to include minority heritage by the mainstream institutions. He says that those are generally based on what the cultural heritage sector wants to convey and its perceptions of accommodating them, that is, immigrant group. And this is the starting point of my presentation. This is where I would like to begin. I'm going to first I'm going to present a theoretical framework that will help me in analyzing analyzing my cases. Then I present case studies and go to either to conclusions, or on the way, maybe I'll have time to present some other examples that are not included in the case studies. My theoretical framework is inspired by Ingold and Kurtila. They were writing and creating this theoretical framework in a context of rural Lapland. But in my own research, I managed to adjust it to the urban setting, and that's why I feel quite secure in using it today. They are distinguishing between MTK, that is the genealogical model to heritage approach to heritage represented by state apparatus, and LTK, the local traditional knowledge. So basically they are distinguishing between the approach to that heritage is transmitted from generation to generation in an unchanged form, MTK, and heritage as performed by real people in real circumstances, that is LTK, the local traditional knowledge. And this local traditional knowledge concept was also further developed by me, and I called it heritage in becoming in my writings. So this is the framework that I'm going to use to talk a little bit about two events by Norsk Folkemuseum, Norwegian Folk Museum, Polish Christmas. This is an annual event with a goal to show how Polish families prepare themselves for Christmas, and a second event, or rather a temporary exhibition that now can be watched. It is digitalized, so it can be watched at Digital Museum, and it's called Pakistani Home. And the goal was to show how a Norwegian Pakistani family could decorate their home in 2002. Let us start from Polish Christmas. As an acknowledgement of the presence of Polish immigrants in Norway, this is currently the biggest immigrant group, the museum has started organizing the event Polish Christmas, and the audiences for this event is not only the diaspora, Polish people, but general public in Norway, including both mainstream population and other minorities. This event, the organizers claim that since the Poles constitute the biggest group, their culture has become a culture of a part of Norwegian culture, and that's why it requires or deserves recognition by this one of the biggest museums in the country. The event features Polish Christmas food and music, workshops on gingerbread baking, Christmas paper decorations making, and so on. And what is displayed during the event reflects a traditional folk version of Polish Christmas traditions, presenting these traditions in their institutional and official version. Very official. So therefore, the event features what I call the MTK, the genealogical approach to heritage. And the question that arises here is why would the museum present the folklore of this immigrant minority when the goal is to present how Polish families prepare themselves to Christmas? And I Googled it a bit, and I found that the event was prepared in collaboration with Polish embassy in Oslo, rather than consulted with the actual Polish Norwegian families living in Norway. And as a matter of fact, the result, the outcome resembles of institutionalized Christmas events common in a cultural and religious sector in Poland that even for Poles in Poland constitute already a folklore. So this goal to represent how Polish families prepare themselves for Christmas was not really met, not even in relation to the Polish families in Poland, not even mentioning Polish families in Norway. But rather the official narration of heritage, as it is seen by national authorities, was reproduced during the event. And as a matter of fact, I happened to conduct a little pilot study among Polish people living in Norway on their engagement with heritage, and Christmas were one of the pictures. I employed visual methods, and this is where the pictures are coming from. So the pictures that I'm displaying now are taken by the respondents of their own Christmas celebrations in Norway. And while the respondents, they attempted to maintain the Christmas folklore as displayed during the folk museum event, the circumstances of living in Norway not always allowed for it due to the limited access to both the products and certain cultural events. What is more, many respondents absorbed Norwegian Christmas traditions into their celebrations, creating a unique composition of Christmas celebrated by Polish families in Norway. And this is what we can see on these pictures. The decorations, not sure if you can see this, Santa Claus here and the star are rather traditional of Norway than traditional of Poland. So the circumstances of living in Norway really impacted the way Polish Christmas is celebrated there. And also the fish that we can see, it is not the traditional one, because this one is not that available in Norway. So the circumstances of living in Norway really influenced how people celebrate Christmas, but these were not reflected by the event in the museum. Well, let us move to the second example, the second case, that is Pakistani Home, this exhibition that is now held digitally. The ambition was very, very similar, to acknowledge the heritage of a settled immigrant minority, that is the Pakistanis. The museum created a contemporary Pakistani room that aimed at grasping how a Pakistani family in Norway lived and in the same time include a minority heritage into a mainstream. Through this, one of the biggest museums in the country. But this initiative, interestingly, took into account to much greater extent the local aspects of immigrants' rootedness in Norway. In comparison to the Polish project. The project was set in cooperation with an actual Norwegian Pakistani family, Ullach, settled in Tøyen neighborhood of Oslo, and actually managed to grasp the lively and local aspect of the traditional knowledge, bringing forward the Pakistani heritage in a form practiced by the minorities. So it seems that the crucial difference between the two events by the same museum was the choice of the partners to consult the project, national authorities, that is the embassy, versus local ordinary people engaging with the heritage the museum was displaying. Sometimes this picture of complexity of immigrants' heritage is grasped by the museum. Sometimes it is not, that it seems this is a matter of consultation, how the project is prepared. And before I move to the conclusions, I would like to touch upon a transformation of both minority and mainstream heritage through immigrants' engagement with it. Something that was mentioned already by Professor when you were talking about jazz. Here, this example comes from a Norwegian Turkish community. A respondent, Ayşe, claims to involve Advent calendar, that is Christian and Norwegian tradition, into the celebrations of Ramadan, the fasting month of Muslims, showing how minority heritage is being transformed by living in another country. And here I'm presenting the engagement of minorities with the heritage of Norway, mainstream heritage. This is a Constitution Day parade. And we can see women, probably of Turkish origin, wearing Islamic veils, combining them with traditional Norwegian folk dresses. If you like, you can see here people in a more traditional versions of this clothing without Islamic veils, while here bunat, because this is how it is called, is combined with a veil. So the picture of complexity is there. And minorities' engagement with heritage has the power of heritage transformation, no matter whether this is a mainstream or minority heritage, and it is happening. I'm coming to the conclusions then now. So museums and institutions attempting at inclusion of the heritage of immigrant minorities must answer a question of what they wish to display: the folklore of immigrant homeland or the actual heritage practices of immigrant minorities settled in a receiving country. If this is the latter, then the participation of immigrants in the attempts of their heritage inclusion is crucial to reach an adequate picture of the heritage in becoming. So there is no inclusion without participation, I would say. And I have some more detailed conclusions, recommendations. A dialogue between the institutions and heritage users is needed to secure that adequate picture of minority heritage and to overcome essentialism that reduces minorities' engagement with cultural heritage to the folklore. The lack of such a dialogue results in overlooking an important process of cultural heritage adaptation to the local circumstances, the process that I called heritage in becoming. Secondly, the institutions should acknowledge the distinction between the folklore of immigrants' homeland and the actual heritage practices of immigrant minorities. The former should not be sold as the latter. Those are two different things. And it seems that the wise choice of the partners to consult the display of minorities' heritage is critical to reach these goals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think we've got now like maximum 10 minutes for discussion. There are some questions in chat and so just the first question is to Professor Xanthaki. What about private sector? Are they filling a gap anywhere? So from Alison Hartcourt. And the second question is to all the panelists. What responsibility to the EU have the protection and conservation of cultural heritage in the projects the EU funds in non-EU countries, and in particular African countries? So these are the first two questions, and more questions are coming.
So shall I?
Yes, please.
Yes. So I'm not sure whether that's a brilliant question, Alison. And hello, I'm not sure. I'm not sure which part of the private sector you have in mind. Of course, there are a lot of parts of the private sector. Google. Of course, there are a lot of parts of the private sector that help with cultural policies, but the first issue is that they're not. One would focus on the EU institutions for this specific presentation and this specific seminar. And if you're asking me whether the private sector controls the decisions of the EU, seriously, is this what you're asking me? Do I need to give a very direct answer? Of course, they are controlling the agenda.
Oh, hi, Alexandra. Yeah, I was just thinking about the Google Arts project and the fact that Google has been implementing things like Europeana at the national level. And because Google is so involved in a lot of these preservation projects and is also funding a lot of this on the private side, not so much are they controlling the EU agenda, but if they're just controlling the agenda generally, whether Google is deciding to do, I don't know, Syrian refugee, these sorts of projects, and not the EU, how much they're steering the agenda, and whether
Yes.
these sorts of things are filling gaps. Thank you.
Yes. Alison, what a brilliant question. I haven't focused on Google in my work, but there's something to do. And thank you so much. Yes, private companies, but also private sector influences a lot the choices that are being made, and you know, generally with the civil society, but also with the kind of the private sector, sometimes this is good because they do have the money to kind of push things forward, and sometimes this is bad because it's not always for the love of culture and the love of heritage. But for example, when we talk about private sector, in the EU, we have to remember that there are about 200, I think last time that I counted, there were about 200 projects that are ongoing on migrant cultural policies. So it's just that the law is just non-existent. So in terms of action, there's quite a lot happening. But that was a brilliant question, comment, and maybe we should all check Google and their kind of interest on cultural policies. Thank you.
Okay, and now thank you. We now got three other questions. So the question is about the obligations of the EU towards other countries, if I understand correctly. Yes, the conservation of cultural heritage projects to the EU funds in non-EU countries, in particular African countries. So it's one question to all the panelists. The second question is from this was from Stephen Brand. The next one is from Beatriz Barreiro Carril, and it's about tolerance, and is very much linked to Professor Wiesand's talk on and the slide with Valle de los Caídos, and the next question is to Karolina Nikielska-Sekula from Christine Hausler. Yes, it's about when you mentioned that cultural institutions should decide what the displays should the migrants not decide. Is that what you mean? What the dialogue with heritage users? You have examples of such a dialogue. Okay, so this is for the moment. So if you could start, Professor Wiesand, I see your.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that it is interesting that actually the relations with non-EU countries, especially in the former colonial countries in Africa and Asia, were the only ones for decades who also had cultural components in the EU. You know, that is was an exception, because at that time in the 1970s and 80s, the EU still had no cultural action you could really mention at all. And only with regard to these countries, there were some limited possibilities to take into account cultural issues. However, I would doubt that this concerned the main industrial or whatever development projects that were being funded. I mean, that is another story.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nikielska.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this question and for pointing out an important issue. I just remind the question to everybody. So it is whether shouldn't it be the migrants who decide? And the short answer is yes. Of course, it should be the migrants, not the cultural heritage institutions. Perhaps I should rephrase this conclusion, but we need to know that migrants, because of power relations, rarely get to decide, unfortunately. So it would be ideal if the migrants could always decide. but whether we can reach it, it's another question. But by saying that cultural heritage institutions should decide what they want to display, I wanted to perhaps underline more the need to make clear whether what is displayed is a folklore of some particular country without a connection to the migrants, or whether this is this is a cultural heritage that is represented by a community that we are hosting, or that is inhabiting this particular country the institution is located within. So I agree. I should have put it perhaps differently, but the point is not to mistaken the folklore and the orientalization of migrants' heritage for heritage of the migrants. Hopefully I answered. Thank you.
Okay, and we have two questions. So one is to Professor Xanthaki, one to Professor Wiesand. So Professor Xanthaki is the question about from our student, the cooperation as a way to protect minority culture between member states. And to Professor Wiesand, it's about the importance, the value of tolerance today in the Union, especially here is the case of Spain and the problem of the difficult past. No, so the full question is in a Q&A, because it's very long, so I don't have time to read the full question. But if you could read yourself, so it's about the value of tolerance today. So thank you, Professor Xanthaki.
Yes, thank you so much, Sophia. What an important question. So what you're saying is that the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU says that there can be collaboration between states, but what happens, in the case law? I think that you referred to the European Court of Human Rights. Is there also an obligation for collaboration? No. The first actor that is responsible for implementing the protection of cultural heritage is the state where this cultural heritage exists, and this is the problem in a way, that the state that very often is the one that violates the cultural heritage of minorities is the actor that is being asked to protect the cultural heritage of that minority. However, what I find really interesting in your question is that there are minorities of kin states. So when we talk about Hungarians in Romania and Romanians in Hungary, then ideally what would happen is that maybe there should be some kind of collaboration. But I have to say that coming from Greece, if you said that in order to protect the Turkish cultural heritage, which should in Greece, we should ask Turkey, probably it's not going to work. So it is the actual state first of all, but sometimes the two states can collaborate. What is also, very important is that really it should be exactly like Karolina told us. It should be the actual minorities themselves that are going to lead these discussions and are going to lead how the ways that their cultural heritage should indeed be protected. And very often states make this into a political issue, but we should resist this need, and we should always put our feet down and say this is also a human rights issue. It's not about politics. It is about human rights and the benefits that cultural heritage has for the individual. Thank you.
Unfortunately, the only convention the EU has ever been decided to be part of is the UNESCO Convention of 2005 on the diversity of cultural expressions. And not that I dislike that convention, but I must underline what has already been hinted by Alexandra, that this convention does not really address cultural heritage at all. On the contrary, I was part of the a special group of experts for this convention. So I know how desperately the UNESCO always tried to avoid anything that has to do with heritage in the context of this convention, because they wanted to just keep this apart from the other conventions that exist, you know. So there's internally maybe some sort of competition inside UNESCO. I think it would do some good if we would include at least the heritage that is in transition between heritage and contemporary creation into that context, so the heritage would then have its place. Thanks. Maybe a word to Beatrice with regard to what she wrote about the culture war in Spain. I fully agree with you, but maybe I answered to it in a different way. You all remember seeing these examples of monuments being toppled, monuments of former colonial heroes in UK, for example, or in Belgium. The question is really how to lead that dialogue about heritage, you know, and my personal opinion, and I seem to agree with you, is that one should, instead of toppling a monument, one should rather recontextualize it in order to understand our own hybrid situation and history better than instead of just destroying it. Same as renaming streets or similar issues. It helps more to put it in the proper context and create a reflection on it instead of destroying or just erasing heritage.
Thank you so much. I think we are about to conclude now because we are over. So maybe the last, like the final words. Now, if you because you presented a number of challenges of in relation to this relation of the protection of human rights and broader management of governance of heritage issues. So what would be your final words? What is the way for the future? So should be a new protocol to the Convention on Human Rights? Should be a larger ratification of our convention? Should be maybe something different? So what in view should be the way how the Union, or maybe broadly Council of Europe should proceed in the next year? So what will be the main line or the main methodology of protecting cultural rights?
I can answer very briefly. From my and also others' presentations, I would say that what is important is to involve immigrant minorities at every stage of the process, from the top, from the planning to the implementation. This would be from my side.
And from my side, I would go back to something that I've written about, but also Andreas talked fragmentation. There should be dialogue between, the EU and the UN, because we can see Beatrice also kind of mentioned a case before the European Court of Justice. You know, we can definitely see discrepancies that lower the existing standards and show lack of knowledge of the existing standards and also the existing concepts when it comes to discrimination, to the real meaning of integration, to the real understanding of cultural rights. So the end of fragmentation and more cross-fertilization.
Well, I don't think we need to encourage the EU more than many networks have done so far to take care or to increase their activity in the field of cultural policies and heritage. They do as much as they can according to the contracts, even so if some of this is of course based on the values that are dominant in the EU, and those are of course economic aspects and nothing else. But let me just come back to what I tried to say before. I don't think we should bring heritage into our discussion as a blueprint for every social norms or values which are contemporary for us today. We should rather see it as a chance to recognize the positive, ambiguous, or problematic norms and values of the distant or near past. And some of these issues, in order to recognize what is still violent today. You know, that was basically also the question of Beatrice Carril. And so when we do preserve, and we should, and bring heritage to life again, then we should be aware of this ambiguity and learn from it. And that is actually why a good museum or a good site should be created, or a good traditional practice should be encouraged and financed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this conclusion of this difficult discussion, a difficult topic, and I think we need to close this session, and I'm passing the voice to Florida, to Professor Krepel.
I just want to thank everyone, panelists and participants, including students. Extremely engaged and interesting. It's always great to run out of time before you run out of questions, actually, because it makes everyone want more. So again, I want to emphasize that we have yet our final panel in this series coming up, I believe on April 20th. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date, but we will send out information to everyone who is registered for this panel. It's on a similar but not exactly the same topic. And I would encourage all of you to take a look at our website, where we have the previous panel discussion and more information just about this project as a whole. Also information about all of our panelists on the registration site that will also be on the website. Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful, wonderful workshop or panel. Great. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day, morning, evening, night, depending on where everyone is. So thank you so much.
Thank you.